Hey guys, welcome to the Son of Wanda. Today we'll be reviewing She-Hulk Attorney at Law Episode 7. So let's conversationalize. Alright guys, so in general this episode did not have a ton to offer, just like the last one, and if you couldn't tell by my review of the last one, I really did not like it. The last one, episode 6, was an entirely pointless episode, and this one had a few things that, like, okay, that was kind of interesting, but, I mean, not a ton, not a lot. A lot of it was just filler and just weird stuff. But nonetheless, let's dive right into it. So it starts off with Jen texting back and forth with her new boyfriend she acquired in the last episode. His name is Josh, and she's been going on dates with him, and they seem to have been having a good time, and I kind of liked that they were depicting it as like, hey, they were enjoying each other's company. They were actually depicting a dude being nice to her and kind of liking her for her, even though that kind of gets ruined later in the episode, and we'll get to that later, obviously. But eventually they end up spending the night with each other, which ends up being important to the plot later in the episode. But after that happens, she wakes up and, he's not there. She gives him text saying, that she had fun. And I forgot to mention earlier, there was a specific camera trick that they pulled that I actually kind of thought was cool, where Jen was walking in to the kitchen and getting something out of the fridge, but then you see Jen also drinking something at the table. At the same time, you see her getting something from the fridge and it's panning away. And they do that with more things throughout as the shot is panning from the kitchen to the living room. I just thought that was cool cinematography. But anyway, slight compliment there. She texts him after the night, and he doesn't respond. And then she tries to text him to ask him, what you up to today, like if you want to get together. But then she stops herself, I guess just because she thought it was awkward. So she goes to work and talks to Nikki about it. And then Nikki asks if Jennifer was digging into the intelligentsia stuff that was established at the end of the last episode. That organization that doesn't like She-Hulk. And She-Hulk's response is like, oh, well, I don't need to worry about a bunch of losers who can't even face me in person because they know I'll, whoop their butts. I didn't really, like I said in my last review, I felt like a lot of those, not that we're gonna kill She-Hulk or try to kill She-Hulk, or how can we kill She-Hulk, like all of that stuff is obviously dumb. But some of the memes and other stuff before that, I was like, there's some valid arguments and criticisms there. But I feel like the showrunners and the writers just all treat it all the same, and they just treat it all like, oh, well, it's all bad, and it's all, every criticism is just bad. And so, of course, that's how, She-Hulk reacts to it, is just like, it's, oh, they're just a bunch of losers. So I didn't really appreciate that. But moving on, she still has not gotten a response from Josh, and she's, obsessed with, her phone, looking at her phone every second, trying to, see if she's gotten a new message from him. Like, she does yoga, she looks at her phone. There's one scene where she's watching the Muppets, and it's funny because whatever episode she's watching is Miss Piggy in a jail cell, and Miss Piggy is pulling the jail cell bars apart to get out, and I just thought that was appropriate considering She-Hulk is watching Miss Piggy, an insanely strong girl, and pulling the bars apart. I just thought that was a funny nod, but she's still checking her phone, and then eventually, finally, the plot kicks into motion, and Sunday morning she wakes up and gets a call from Abomination's parole officer saying that the device that was meant to prohibit Blonsky from turning into the Abomination had malfunctioned, and he wanted her to go with him as protection in case he had turned into the Abomination. And it's funny because he says they didn't have the resources to send out troops with him to protect him, which I didn't really get that. I didn't know why they wouldn't have had necessary troops to be able to say, hey, come with me so I don't die at the hands of a monster. Thought that was weird. But he requests her help, her Hulk help, and she's like, okay, I'll do it. And again, constantly checking her phone. I did think it was funny, on the way to Blonsky's meditation resort, in the midst of constantly checking her phone, she is listening to Mbop by the pop rock band called Hanson. So I thought that was funny. And she's even singing to it, so I genuinely laughed at that one. But she and the parole officer get to the resort. The parole officer examines the device on Blonsky and discovers that it really did just malfunction because apparently Blonsky touched an electric fence while he was trying to save his favorite chicken. And he's so happy about it. And that's the thing, is like, if this character's villain name is the Abomination, you don't have a character whose villain name is the Abomination talking about saving his favorite chicken. And of course he didn't actually turn into Abomination because the thing just malfunctioned. But yeah, now we've got Blonsky talking about his favorite chicken. Whatever. Anyway, the parole officer leaves. Jin is about to leave when Manbull and El Aguilier, I can't pronounce his name. He's a mutant. He's a Spanish mutant from the comics. And Manbull is literally a man bull. And he's also from the comics. These guys are actually real comic characters, believe it or not. They're like some of those no-name Batman villains like Polka Dot Man or Eraser. I'm not kidding, those are real. Go look those up. But yeah, these guys are fighting, and they end up trashing Jin's car in the process, so she can't go home. And she's all mad about that. But Blonsky's trying to tell her, like, oh, you know, there's something that you could be taught. Like, life could be trying to teach you something out of this. And he's trying to be all deep because he's the leader of this meditation resort. And she doesn't want to listen, and so he's like, well, you know, you don't seem very teachable right now, so I'll just go away for now. And so he leaves, and the whole time she's just trying to... The meditation resort had Wi-Fi, so she's just trying to get a signal so she can check to see if she got any messages from Josh. Like, literally the whole time, she walks all around the resort trying to get a signal. Nothing. She eventually comes across this barn, which is where, you know, Blonsky is having his group therapy sessions with, you know, the Manbull and the El Aguila guy, as well as the new characters. One's named Porcupine and the other is named Saracen. Now, what's interesting about Saracen is that Blonsky mentions how he thinks he's a vampire, like that's his mental thing that he's dealing with. And apparently Saracen is actually a real vampire from the Marvel Comics. He's like one of the oldest living vampires, which, I mean, I guess I don't know if you say a vampire is living, but he's one of the oldest surviving vampires in the Marvel Comics. But in this, he's just, you know, the very goofy guy. We don't even know if he's an actual vampire, even though he keeps talking about sucking blood. But I thought that was an interesting detail, and they seem to be more and more alluding to vampire stuff, and because we know the movie Blade will be coming out eventually. Funnily enough, we got recent reports that the director that was attached to the Blade project has now stepped down, so I guess they'll have to find a new director for that movie, and I'm pretty sure the movie was meant to start production very soon. Talk about problematic timing. But yeah, it seems like they're just alluding to more vampire stuff to, you know, set up Blade later. Also, Manbull, like I said, is a character from the comics. He's a bad guy. He's literally a dude who is genetically transformed into a man, a human crossed with a bull. And he, just like Lizard or Rhino, as the Spider-Man villains, he actually, funnily enough, had a lot of run-ins with Daredevil. That also probably is meant to be an homage to, oh yeah, Daredevil's gonna be in the show eventually. And speaking of Daredevil, you know, we got the scene where the fashion guy's holding the box with the Daredevil's helmet inside at the end of episode 5. And we were all like, hey, Daredevil's gonna be the next episode. No, he wasn't. It was a pointless wedding episode. Okay, Daredevil will for sure be in this episode. Wrong. It's like the show doesn't know how to continue tension at all. Or like payoff. Mainly the payoff is the problem. Because when you like have something at the end of a certain episode, you kind of expect that should at least be addressed somewhat in the next episode. But no. I mean, like, you know, we got a tease for Jen's superhero costume in the same episode, in episode 5. And, you know, nothing has happened. We haven't seen it. She just keeps wearing these different outfits that, you know, aren't even that great looking. And still no Daredevil. So, you know, more filler. Yay! Anyway, also, El Aguila, El guy, I can't pronounce his name. He is actually a mutant from the comics. His power is like electrical generation, which they actually exhibit later in the episode when he like pulls out his sword and electricity starts coming out of it. And Blonsky even says, don't use your bioelectrical powers, which means that it's coming from the dude's body. So I think it's pretty interesting that they actually, you know, are putting more and more mutant Easter eggs and trying to incorporate mutants more into the MCU, because of course at the end of Miss Marvel we learned that she was a mutant, that she had the mutant gene. I didn't watch that show, but I watched the last part just because I was intrigued, like, hey, mutants are in the MCU now. And also, there was an Easter egg in, I believe it was episode 2, where Jen is looking on her computer, and one of the articles on the side of the screen said, "Man in bar fights with metal claws." So, obviously a nod to Wolverine. So, that is interesting. And we did just recently get confirmation that Deadpool 3 will be coming out in 2024. And Hugh Jackman will be returning as Wolverine for Deadpool 3. But it will take place in the MCU. So, I don't know if that means that Hugh Jackman is going to be Wolverine, like, for the MCU, or if this is just like a one-time thing and they're just going to do some multiverse stuff. Either way, it sounds like a pretty good idea, but yeah, they seem to be incorporating more and more the idea of like, hey, mutants are coming. They're going to be more prevalent soon enough in the MCU. But for now, Jen actually found like one bar that she could get on her phone in the barn where they're having their group therapy session, and she's like, okay, I'll just stay here in this 1 square foot of Wi-Fi space. And she says work here, but she's clearly not working. She clearly just wants to make sure she's there in case Josh texts her. And at this point, it's been 2 days, because this text was on Friday, and this is Sunday where she's at the meditation resort. But, you know, the Blonsky's group therapy session, they're talking about their different problems, and all of these guys are super quirky. Like, the porcupine doesn't want to take his costume off, which is kind of a funny thing. Like, if you ever see superhero cartoons or shows depict the villains, like, in prison but still wearing their villain outfits, that doesn't really make sense if you're trying to rehabilitate them. So it was kind of a funny thing when they're like, you probably should take the costume off so you don't, you know, act or think you're a porcupine anymore. Like, I'm not really sure what even his mental issue was. Other than just he wanted to wear the suit. He said it made him feel more comfortable. I don't know. And then, you know, of course, the Saracen vampire guy keeps talking about, like, I want to suck your blood. I want to suck your blood. But he doesn't actually say it like that. And he keeps talking about blood. And, of course, you know, Manbull has an issue with the Spanish guy. And the Spanish guy has some kind of issue with people calling him a matador, because he actually wants to be just a swashbuckler. All sorts of weird quirks and things and stuff. But eventually, the Wrecker shows up from episode 3, who's the leader of the Wrecking Crew, the guy's trying to get the blood from She-Hulk at the end of episode 3. You know, that plot line that has been barely continued since it was established. Other than the very tip ending of the last episode. But it was funny because Jen, when she sees him, she's like, did we not do... Like, in the previously on segment, did we not show this guy, like, to remind you guys of this guy? Let's do a real quick previously on segment to remind you guys of who this guy is and him being part of the Wrecking Crew and trying to steal her blood. And so it was just funny that, like, again, it's one of those completely on-the-nose fourth wall breaks. Like, she knows full well that she's in a TV show. And again, I don't really know how I feel about that in the MCU, because it always kind of did have, at least in Phase 1 and 2 and 3, they kind of had more of a grounded feel, but they've completely let that go in Phase 4, and I don't think it's for the better. By far, I believe it's for the worse, because like I've said in previous reviews, that just means if they don't take their own universe seriously, then I don't take their universe seriously, even if it is Marvel and has the Marvel logo on it. But anyway, she does that little previously on bit, and then of course, since the guy tried to attack her, she's mad and turns into She-Hulk and throws him into a bunch of chairs. And the group therapy guys are like, oh no, that's not how we do things here. We have to talk through our problems. And even, you know, the Wrecker seems compliant with that, and She-Hulk begrudgingly agrees. So she becomes a part of the group therapy session. And that leads to Wrecker, you know, talking about how, oh, well, I just kind of had to discover that, you know, I had to fix what was wrong about myself. And I just had to look in the mirror, and I had to realize that, you know, having a magic crowbar didn't make me more powerful, and it made me just look like an idiot, and all the dudes I was with, like the Wrecking Crew, looked like a bunch of idiots. And it was so weird, because when you already have a character that's been barely established and, you know, had not had really any other characterization than he's working for an organization who wants She-Hulk's blood, and then you switch him on a dime to where, like, oh, now he's sorry, and now he's part of this meditation resort, when he really, like, if She-Hulk's found him, then he should be arrested, because he committed assault on a woman in episode 3. So it's just, like, funny that they don't even address that. Like, oh, he's in the resort now, even though he's a convict. I don't understand that. Like, there really is no logic in that terms of when the show has to deal with stuff like that, the stuff that, like, the actual legal stuff, like none of it really does make a ton of sense. But anyway, he's flat out apologizes to She-Hulk for what he did, and She-Hulk doesn't accept his apology. She's all, like, sarcastic, like, oh yeah, sorry, helps so much. And then, the group doesn't take to that very well, and they're like, man, you got She-Hulk, you got a lot of problems on the inside. And she's like, no, I'm fine. But then they say, and I did like this because the show is finally admitting that She-Hulk definitely has some flaws. Like, she's not a perfect character, and they seem to be finally admitting that from my perspective, the show was kind of on the side of the group therapy guys, like, trying to convince her, like, yeah, you do have a little bit of issues. Like, the one guy says, like, if you went out of control and threw a dude into the chairs, and you, like, have stuck on your phone the whole time. And even Blonsky says, like, yeah, you've been glued to that thing, which I did like that line because it was true. I will say, the problem is that they've kind of dug themselves into a hole. They've pointed out a flaw in their own show, because in the first episode, She-Hulk was telling Bruce, like, oh, I can control my anger just fine because I do it every day. Clearly, though, she's had trouble with it, and that was even kind of implied in the previous episodes, or pretty much flat out just, oh yeah, she was, at one point, she was, like, crushing a stapler without knowing it. And if you think about it, like, even though it's, like, a very small thing, it's like, that's not really controlling your anger. And she completely was fine to just lash out without giving any second thought or even reviewing the situation just at record, and just throws him into a bunch of chairs. So it's like she has completely disproven her own argument that, oh yeah, I control my anger just fine. I don't need any help. Like, I always can get that down. Like, that's not going to be a problem. Clearly, it's kind of a problem. And I do hope that maybe by the end of the series, like, she will come to a realization that, oh, Bruce was right. This isn't as easy as it looks. And I kind of need to help. If I have these powers, I kind of have a responsibility to be able to help these people with these powers, because I'm one of the few people that can do that. And also, like Bruce was right about, like, I probably need some help in controlling how to be a Hulk. And so I hope that's where it will lead. I hope that my previous optimism in episode 1 will be reestablished, and, like, hey, they were doing what I hoped they would do. But I mean, I'm not exactly sure. Anyway, that all leads to her admitting that she's been trying to see if her boyfriend has texted her back. That leads to the group of dudes asking, like, her a bunch of questions, like, how many dates have you been on, and what was the last thing you texted him? At first she's like, well, the last thing I texted him was, I had a lot of fun. But then she admits that the most recent thing she texted him was, I just wanted to make sure you are right because I was kind of worried. And then she sent the blushing smiley face emoji. And that was when all the guys were like, oh my gosh, we can't believe you did that. And even the Spanish guy was like, why would you do that? And that was another moment where I did, like, audibly laugh. So there were several moments in this episode where I was like, that was funny. Which is, more than I can say for the previous 5. But anyway, Wrecker comes to the conclusion that he's like, well, there's a very high possibility that, he just ghosted you. And of course, that idea, makes Jen very sad. But it's also funny. There's another scene that made me laugh was, like, after he says that, then the vampire guy's like, or he wants to suck your blood. And then the Wrecker guy's like, no, not that. It was just funny because you could hear the disgust in his voice. He's like, no. And then just I don't know why those things make me laugh and some of the don't. But at least I laughed a little bit in this episode. But it's also interesting because when the vampire guy says that, the man bull brings up, is like, he says, not everybody's your dad. You don't have to keep talking about blood. And then the vampire guy's like, don't mention my dad. So, like, I looked it up, and like I said, Saracen was in the comics as a vampire, but I didn't really find anything about, like, his father, or if there was any significance there. Like, it didn't really even mention a dad. So I don't know if that was meant to allude to something more, but I did think it was kind of an on-the-nose thing to just say, don't mention my dad. It's kind of like, that could be alluding to something, but again, this is a comedy show, and they're probably just, clutching on to whatever they can find to get a slight laugh out of somebody. Anyway, this leads to the moment in the episode that I thought, oh, that is an interesting idea. I felt it was fairly well explained, and it could have worked for the whole premise of the entire show. as an actual character arc for her, for She-Hulk. She admits, or she's like talking to the dudes and kind of opening up about how the She-Hulk persona, like being She-Hulk, she compares the She-Hulk persona to a person in high school who is always more attractive than you, or athletic than you, or just like, I guess, better than you in all sorts of different ways. And she says that like She-Hulk is essentially that person for Jen Walters. Like Walters is the one that's kind of jealous of She-Hulk because everybody loves She-Hulk and all the dudes like She-Hulk, and like she is the one who gets all the attention, while Jennifer Walters, she's like asked the question like, would anybody like me if I was just Jen? Because I think Jen is great, but you know, I don't think anybody would really pay attention to Jen because of, you know, Jen's not She-Hulk, and they really only pay attention to me if I'm She-Hulk. And that was an interesting idea. Like, I like the way she compared it to like the person in high school who's always like more attractive than you and all that stuff. I thought that was an interesting premise, and I think the inherent flaw that is brought about by doing this is, you know, that could have been the premise of the whole show. It's kind of just like her having to deal with the split persona, like the other girl, like the other guy kind of thing that Bruce Banner was having to deal with, but in her own way. Like Bruce had to deal with the other guy in the sense of like, if I lose my cool or get stressed in any slight way, I might destroy a city or a building or kill a bunch of people. But hers, you know, I mean, a lot less dangerous, obviously, but more like personal in the sense of, yeah, she's essentially of the same mind when she's, you know, Jen or when she's She-Hulk. Like, her mind doesn't really change. She doesn't really have like a split personality, but it is more of like an image. Like when she's She-Hulk, everybody loves her and everybody thinks she's great just because she's She-Hulk. But when she's Jennifer Walters, everybody's like, oh, okay, she's just Jen Walters. We don't really care. And so, you know, that could have been an idea that could have carried the whole show. It could have carried the whole season, having to deal with that dynamic in her daily life. But I guess she kind of has been in different ways, but they've been just focusing on more just superficial nonsense stuff. It's like a bunch of different random dates and a bunch of different this and a bunch of different that. And it's like, and we're dealing with magic and we're dealing with, you know, trying to get Blonsky a parole, and there was a better way they could have done it. And they didn't focus on that part nearly enough. Like if that was going to be their plan for her as a character arc, which isn't really a character arc, but there was just this one scene in this episode that kind of established how she actually feels. And I mean, there was something to allude to that in the last episode, but she was all like drunk, so it was kind of coming out in like a weird way. But this one, it was a lot more clear and a lot better explained of how, like, yeah, like, you know, I'm Jen Walters, and I want to be liked because I'm Jen Walters, and, you know, that's why I liked this guy Josh, because he seemed to like me for me, and not me because I was She-Hulk. And so, of course, she was really sad at the idea of him ghosting her, because, you know, he was like the first dude she found that actually liked her for being Jen and not for being She-Hulk. Interesting idea, but wasted plot line. You could have used that for the whole show, but they didn't do it. Anyway, the guys, like, at first they're like, we must go find Josh and kill him. And even the Spanish guy like pulls out his electric sword, and Blonsky's like, no, we don't need to do the electric powers in here. And they kind of just all calm down. Eventually they just tell her like, delete Josh from your messages app. And they're all like, delete. And then she finally just deletes him. And I was like, okay, that escalated quickly. It did seem like, okay, yes, I guess it's extreme if the person doesn't text you back for 2 days, but to just delete them from your messages app is a little, I think is a little extreme. They're all like cheering, and that she was able to let go of, like, you know, not have to rely so much on what this one dude thought of her. And they even bring up the fact that we all like you for you. Like, we don't mind hanging around Jen. Like, it really doesn't matter if you're She-Hulk or not. And so, like, they encourage her to turn into Jen, and she does, and they're all like, yay, and they're cheering. And I did think it was actually kind of nice that they depicted the guys as actually being genuinely supportive of her, and they weren't talking down to her. They were bringing up her flaws, but they were trying to help her. And, like, Abomination, of all people, is the leader of these guys, helping Jen Walters with her problems. So, yeah, I mean, it's a nice sentiment. They all cheer for her. She ends up going into the yurt that Blonsky had mentioned earlier in the episode, that there was like a relaxing yurt that you could go into, and she does, and when she comes out, all the guys cheer for her. And so, they're very supportive of her, and I did enjoy that they actually allowed the dudes to be supportive of her and encourage her, like, hey, we like Jen. Even she says, like, when she's saying her goodbyes, she's like, I'll never forget you guys, I actually really enjoyed our time together. And so I thought that was a nice sentiment. But I think the inherent problem is, it's kind of cool that Blonsky helped her, and you had that moment with them, but at the same time, it's like, again, you don't take a hardened military guy from the Edward Norton Hulk movie who's like just fueled with rage, and he just wanted power, and when he got that power, he just used it all to like destroy the whole city and fight the Hulk. And now he's just this, sage namaste meditation coach. I just don't, he's not the right character for that. If you wanted, Jen Walters to spend a whole day on a meditation resort, do it with somebody else. Don't do it with Abomination. Like, I don't even really mind them taking the no-names and putting them in this episode, because there are no-names. Like, these unknown characters that nobody knows about. That was redundant. But yeah, like Manbull and Porcupine, like, nobody knows who these guys are. Nobody cares if you take them into this show and, like, turn them into something that they weren't in the comics and make them comical. Like, they're expendable because, like, nobody knows and nobody cares. But for Blonsky, it's completely different. It's like he's been in the MCU before. He was the main villain in the Edward Norton Hulk movie. I guess other than General Ross, but he's important and he's evil. And you need to treat him as such. So that's the inherent problem of that whole thing. Anyway, they called in a tow truck, so they got her car and she's driving with the tow truck back home. And then they cut to 3 days earlier when Jen and Josh actually spend the night together. It shows Josh getting up out of the bed because, he was gone by morning because they had established that earlier in the episode. And he's getting up out of bed and he's got his phone on top of Jen's phone. And his phone has a bunch of words going across the screen, and at the top it says copying. And I wasn't really sure what that was meant to entail. Like, I didn't really know what he would be copying from Jen's phone or why that would be important. Like, I didn't think there was anything on Jen's phone for there to be important enough to copy. I thought that, like, maybe it might have something to do with the message that Nikki sent to her explaining intelligentsia. Maybe he was trying to get that information off Jen's phone so she wouldn't look into it further. But then he sends a text to the Hulk King chat, and it's emojis of like a syringe with blood in it, some like chemical vial, and a thumbs up. And at first I took that to mean that, oh wait, so is he like saying that because he had taken a picture of Jen Walters to, I assume, to send to the Hulk King chat. At first I thought that it was meant to be like, hey, you can come get our blood now. I'm glad I looked it up beforehand because I wanted to look it up to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting, and apparently I was, because I read an article that made me realize he had actually already gotten the blood. That's what that meant, the syringe and then the vial and then the thumbs up meant like, oh yeah, I got the blood samples. Which I didn't understand. I feel like that could have been expressed in a lot clearer way, because it didn't make sense in my head that, like, when would he have been able to get her blood? Like, it didn't make sense that he would be able to get it while she was asleep, because, even if you're asleep, you're going to feel a syringe going into your skin, drawing blood from you. That's going to wake you up. So I didn't really understand how he was able to get it, in what way. But, he has the blood samples now. And that's, that and the previously established, Jen Walters finally admitting that she doesn't like the fact that She-Hulk keeps getting all the attention while Jen Walters nobody really cares about. Those are the only two things that move the plot forward in the whole episode. And we're on episode 7. That's a problem. And even though I didn't like WandaVision and Falcon and Winter Soldier, at least WandaVision and Falcon and the Winter Soldier, WandaVision being 9 episodes like She-Hulk, and then Falcon and Winter Soldier being 6, at least they get their plot underway at a decent enough time. She-Hulk doesn't even do that. It's like we're on literally episode 7. There are only 2 episodes left, and Daredevil. They haven't touched on her, other than a few scenes, her conflict with the other She-Hulk, like being She-Hulk and being Jen. Maybe like in a few different ways here and there, but like not any ones that actually counted for you to be like, oh man, that's kind of sad. Like, this is the only time in the whole series where she explains it. I was like, oh yeah, that is a problem. I can see that being a problem for somebody. That was literally it. That was the only thing that actually kind of compelled me. And so, 7 episodes in. That's it. But plot has barely gotten underway. We only just introduced the idea of the intelligentsia organization trying to get her blood. I mean, we had that introduced at the end of episode 3, the wrecking crew trying to get her blood. But, that plot could have been moved forward so much quicker. But instead, we ended up focusing on all this filler of, magic and the stallion and light elves and just pointless nonsense that has absolutely no effect on the MCU. It is not funny. It's not really entertaining. It's just stuff. Boring, uninteresting nonsense. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Labyrinth, but some of it is almost as weird as Labyrinth, but not in an interesting way that Labyrinth was. Like, I like the movie Labyrinth, and none of the weird stuff in the show has been an interesting weird. Because you can do weird in an interesting way, but they have not done weird in an interesting way. And we haven't even gotten really to focus on She-Hulk's actual... She doesn't have a character arc. And, the bad guys are only kind of just now being fleshed out. Josh is working for the intelligentsia, so he turned out not to be a good boyfriend at all. He probably just doesn't love her at all. He probably never really was interested in her. He was just working for them the whole time, trying to get her blood. Which explains how they were able to monitor them having the conversation at the wedding party in the last episode. So there you go. I am disappointed. The quality of the MCU lately, like I said, has just been not good. I wondered, I rewatched No Way Home recently, and I was like, man, how did a studio who helped produce this movie produce this show? How did that the same studio? And I get that you have different people working on these different projects, but you would figure the MCU knows what quality is, because they produced so much good quality stuff before in phases 1, 2, and 3. But phase 4 for the most part has been a dud. Save Loki and No Way Home, at least for me. I mean, Hawkeye wasn't terrible. It was very much mid. It was okay, very much mediocre. And yeah, it's just, I don't think anything other than No Way Home and Loki have actually hit it out of the park. So that's unfortunate for me, but I will continue to remain optimistic for good content in the future. That is She-Hulk Attorney at Law, episode 7. That's my review. We will continue to pray that maybe the last 2 episodes, I have a feeling the last 2 episodes are going to be like a part 1 and a part 2 or something to that effect, where it sets up the final battle with the intelligentsia, who I'm holding out as still led by the leader. Because it would only make sense that him contacting his lackeys via the internet and sending them messages on the computer, just like he did with Bruce Banner in the Edward Norton Hulk movie. I was like, okay, that would make total sense if he was doing the same thing now, trying to get her blood. All of it would, the pieces are perfectly in place for the leader, to the point where if they don't do it, complete waste. Doesn't make sense at all. If it's Kingpin, that's not going to make sense. If it's Roxxon, the Roxxon Corporation from the comics, that's not going to make sense. All of this stuff completely says, at least to me, the leader. And Abomination better be faking. Because if he's not faking, that's going to be the most wasted character in the history of Marvel Studios. And so, that's my hopes for the future. Hopefully we'll get Daredevil soon. But yes, that is my review for She-Hulk Attorney at Law, episode 7. Thank you guys for watching. We will continue to be optimistic for good content and hopeful. May the Lord be with you. May the Force be with you. And have a very blessed day. Goodbye. That is also a wrap.